The door opens to the howl of a desert wind, dust curling around a pair of bare feet on the porch. A folded scrap of paper lies on top of a worn blanket, the ink bleeding slightly from last night's rain. The man's eyes rest not on the girl's belly, but on her hands, clenched, cold, and empty of trust. The air holds a pause, like the moment before a rattlesnake strikes, but here the danger is years long, not seconds. The cabin's single lamp flickers, casting shadows that make the place feel smaller than it is. He stands there a beat too long, body remembering what the mind avoids, breath tight in the ribs, shoulders pulled up by old storms. He does not say welcome, he does not ask why. He only moves enough to let the wind slip past him into the room, carrying the smell of wet dust, iron, and the faint sweetness of creosote. The paper crinkles under the lamp's weak heat. He reads the line again without moving his lips, as if sound might break something already cracked. She's yours now. The words feel like a verdict, or a dare, or a prayer tossed by someone who ran out of prayers. The girl doesn't cross the threshold. She stands at its edge like a cliff learned by heart. Her braids are loose, dark hair sticking to her temples, where the rain cooled, and the fear didn't. A muscle in her jaw stutters, then stills. Hands stay closed at the tips, small crescents of dirt under each nail, the kind children earn and the punished inherit. Her eyes touch the knife on the table, the tin cup, the single peg by the door, measuring exits the way nervous systems do, before language, before bargains. In the small of her back, pain hums like a wire, and she shifts her weight to quiet it, not asking for a chair, not asking for anything. The body negotiates what the world refuses. He reaches for the lamp but doesn't turn it up. Light can be cruel when it pretends to help. Instead, he lifts the scrap of paper with 2 fingers, folds it once, twice, then lays it beneath the lamp's base as if pressing a wound. The rain smear shines like a bruise. Outside, a dun mare paws the hardpan, sensing weather, sensing worry. Somewhere behind the barn, an old hinge complains, then settles. Little sounds make a map of the land, and he follows it to calm his hands. The door remains open. He leaves it that way so air can move, so fear can breathe, so no one feels caged. When he finally speaks, it is plain and low, the way men talk to horses at night. There's dry floor inside, not a promise, not a claim, an observation offered with room around it. She looks past him into the cabin, the narrow bed, the stove with its thin pipe, the chair wearing a quilt she has not been invited to touch, and something in her shoulders drops the height of a single coin. Not trust, not yet. A pause in the fight or flight, the nervous system finding a third way. Stay alert, but stand. He notices it because he has lived years counting changes no one else sees. On the coat nail, nothing hangs. On the windowsill, a small feather of ash from last summer's fire. The house carries its own kind of pulse, slow and stubborn. The wind pushes hard against the jamb, then gives up. Silence lays down on the threshold, patient as an old dog. He takes one step back. She takes none forward. Between them, damp boards, a knife, a lamp, a note that tries to rename a life. He feels the weight of it in his chest, the way memory knots muscle. The thinking brain can make speeches. The body only tells the truth. His hands ease open at his side so hers don't have to. He does not reach. He will not corner her with kindness. Mercy, if it is real, knows how to leave space. Time lengthens the way it does around pain. Seconds stretch to minutes, breath stretched to prayer. The girl shifts again, and the blanket slides, showing the arc of her belly, the quiet argument of a heartbeat within a heartbeat. He looks away, not out of shame, but out of respect. Eyes resting on the board he once sanded smooth and failed to stain. The lamp flickers, breathing with the wind's calm. He thinks of the ways people get traded without a bill of sale. He thinks of the ways a house loses its voice when grief moves in. Somewhere inside, a door he has kept closed for years moves on its hinges. Not open, not locked, just moving. She does a small thing then, so small it could be missed. She unclenches the right hand first, a soft release, tendons easing, fingers longer in the light. The left follows with less courage but equal need. The nervous system learns safety in drips, not floods. He sees it and mirrors her without words. Jaw loosening, shoulders lowering, breath widening the ribs. 2 bodies teach each other to stand down. Spiritual but practical. How a room can become a sanctuary when no scripture is spoken, only space kept, only threat reduced. Rain ticks once on the sill, then stops. The air smells like cooled metal and wet leather. He moves sideways and pulls the door nearly to, not closing it, not yet, leaving a sliver for the wind to pass through and for choice to stay alive. She looks at that sliver and then at him, and finally, with the caution of someone who has learned to step without leaving tracks, she places the toes of one foot on the dry plank just inside. Not a surrender, a test. The floor holds, the lamp holds. Her breath holds, then lets go a fraction. He nods once, the smallest vow he can afford, and answers not with speech but with a clean tin cup set near, handle turned her way. He didn't offer it to her directly. That would have meant something, and he wasn't ready for meaning. Instead, he took the quilt from the foot of his own bed, the one with the faded blue squares and the corner mended by hands that no longer lived in this world, and draped it over the back of the oak chair by the fire. It was an old sturdy chair, worn smooth by years of use, but tonight it looked like an empty sentinel waiting for someone to claim it. He busied himself at the stove, his back turned, letting the moment sit between them without touching it. She noticed. Her gaze lingered on the corner of the quilt where a patch stood out darker than the rest, thread pulled just a little too tight. She did not ask who had sewn it. She did not have to. That small, uneven stitch was a story, and stories had weight. She seemed to understand that some things aren't given. They're left where someone might find them if they choose. The lamp hissed softly. Outside, the wind scraped against the eaves. He kept his eyes on the pot, but in the silence he could feel her presence in the room the way a man feels the air shift before rain. She stood for a time, still wrapped in the blanket that had been left on the porch with her, before slowly crossing to the chair. Her hands hovered for a moment over the quilt's edge, then withdrew. She sat, without pulling it around her shoulders, her posture straight, her eyes forward, as if accepting shelter came with a cost she wasn't yet willing to pay. He sat opposite her, neither speaking nor looking directly at the other. The fire popped. A knot in the wood split with a soft hiss. Somewhere between them was the truth. That a man can offer kindness without asking, and a girl can refuse without leaving. Both understood it. Neither would name it. The chair held the quilt, and the quilt held the memory of someone who could soften his voice. Tonight that would be enough. The chair held the quilt, and the quilt held the memory of someone who could soften his voice. Tonight that would be enough. Morning came thin and pale, the light crawling slow across the floorboards, touching each object as if asking permission to stay. He had just set a tin of coffee to boil when the sound of a horse's hooves pressed into the silence. Steady, deliberate, carrying the kind of weight that meant business. The rider came into view, framed in the open doorway. A clean badge caught the light on his chest, its shine at odds with the dust on his boots. The marshal didn't dismount at first. He just let his eyes sweep the cabin in one slow pass. When he did step down, the leather creaked in a way that seemed louder than the wind. They met at the threshold, each man keeping his voice level. "Had word," the marshal said, his tone flat but his eyes searching. "Word says you've got company." He didn't look at the quilt or the chair or the pot on the stove. He looked past them, toward the curtain that shielded the far corner. The man didn't answer right away. He let the silence work, let it make the marshal blink first. "Company," he repeated, as if the word needed tasting before he could claim it. Behind the curtain, her shadow shifted, not from curiosity, but from calculation. She kept to the narrow strip where the floorboards didn't creak, body still but breath quickened. The fabric trembled with her. "People talk," the marshal added. He didn't say what they'd do with that talk, but the edges of the sentence held its weight. "Some think it's trouble, others say it's worse." The man's hand rested on the doorframe, thumb brushing against the grain of the wood. "Then let 'em talk," he said, the words quiet but steady. The marshal's gaze held for a long beat, as if measuring whether this house was worth the ride back. Finally, he tipped his hat, not in respect, but in acknowledgement, and stepped away. The sound of his boots on the porch boards carried a warning all its own. When the horse turned back toward the road, the wind followed, pulling the smell of iron and leather out into the open air. Inside, the coffee had gone bitter on the stove. Neither of them moved to pour it. The curtain stayed drawn, but the space between its edge and the floor seemed smaller than before. The curtain stayed drawn, but the space between its edge and the floor seemed smaller than before. By late afternoon, clouds had thickened over the hills, dragging a shadow that deepened the lines of the land. The air felt heavy, full of something that would not ask permission to arrive. When the first drops hit the roof, they came fast, sharp, as if they had been waiting for the right moment to fall. He was at the table mending a strap, when the wind shifted and rain came sideways through the warped frame of the window. The seams of the old roof gave way in the center of the room, letting a cold stream find the floor. He reached for the dented bucket under the counter without looking at her. A moment later, there was the scrape of metal against wood. She had moved quietly and taken another from beside the stove. They worked without speaking, each catching the fall where it landed. Water drummed into tin, steady and unbroken, a rhythm that made the room feel smaller and more honest. She balanced on her heels, one hand steadying the bucket, the other brushing wet strands from her face. He noticed the way she stayed still even when the cold reached her wrists, as if endurance was a language she had been speaking all her life. The smell of wet wood rose around them, rich and sharp, For him it carried a memory that came uninvited. The night his brother hadn't come back from the river, the sodden timbers of the bridge, the rope they'd pulled in empty. He felt it in his chest before he saw it in his mind, a heaviness that tightened the space between heartbeats. Lightning flashed, catching her eyes for a moment. She was watching him, not with curiosity, but with the kind of knowing that didn't need details. She said nothing, he said nothing. But in that shared quiet the buckets filled, and something else did too. A recognition, fragile and unsaid, that survival was easier when the weight was carried by two sets of hands. The storm pressed harder against the roof, but neither of them moved to check for more leaks. They stood where they were, each under their own small rain, holding still as the world outside blurred into water and wind. They stood where they were, each under their own small rain, holding still as the world outside blurred into water and wind. By morning, the air was clear again, washed pale by the storm's passing. He stepped outside to check the fence line, the ground still soft enough to take the print of his boots. That's when he saw it, a woven basket resting on the top rail, steam rising faintly from beneath a folded cloth. He approached it slowly, not out of suspicion but out of habit. Warm bread, the kind that carried the smell of hearth and hands. No note, no tracks close enough to name, just the gift, left to speak for itself. He lifted it and felt the weight, more than the bread should have given, as if it had been pressed with meaning before it was set down. Inside, she was at the table, braiding her hair with deliberate slowness. He placed the basket in the center, pulling back the cloth so the warmth drifted up into the room. She looked at it once, then away, her jaw tightening as though the smell alone was a test she refused to take. After a long pause, her voice came, low, almost flat. "Among mine, gifts left unseen mean debt unpaid. There are strings you cannot see." He nodded, the words settling in like stones in water. "Then we won't owe." Without another word, he took the bread outside. The chickens came first, pecking at the soft pieces he scattered in the dirt, their clucks sharp in the morning air. The dun mare took her share next, ears flicking at the sound of his voice, the crust gone in 2 slow chews. When the basket was empty, he left it on the fence where he'd found it, letting the wind decide what became of it. When he came back in, the table was cleared. Her hands rested in her lap, still, but her eyes carried a trace of something. Not relief, not trust, but the faint recognition that he had chosen her side without asking her to explain it. The space between them felt different now, not smaller, not larger, but shaped by the kind of choice that does not need to be spoken to be understood. The space between them felt different now, not smaller, not larger, but shaped by the kind of choice that does not need to be spoken to be understood. That night, after she had settled into the bed with her back to the wall and the blanket drawn high, he sat alone at the table, the lamplight soft and uneven. His hands rested for a long time on the edge of the drawer before pulling it open. Inside lay a single envelope, the paper inside folded so many times the creases had become part of its grain. The address was written in a hand he barely recognized as his own, Tucson, a woman's name beneath it. A letter that had been started and stopped more times than he could remember. Each sentence inside had cost him something to write, and each time he had been unable to send it, the cost doubled. It told of a river in flood, a brother's empty saddle, the way loss can hollow a man until only his outline remains. It told of nights in a cabin that felt too large for one voice, of words that stayed locked behind his teeth because no one was there to hear them. He unfolded the letter and read it slowly, the words tasting older than the paper. When his eyes reached the end, his fingers tightened, and he lifted it toward the flame. The heat licked the bottom edge, curling it inward. Smoke began to rise, soft and grey, before he pulled it back. Not tonight. He smoothed the charred edge between his fingers, then folded the letter again, slower this time, and placed it back in the drawer, as though returning a knife to its sheath. Across the room she stirred, not fully awake, not speaking, but the rhythm of her breathing shifted, a subtle change he caught without turning his head. It was the kind of breath that comes when the body remembers something it never told the mind. He recognized it. He had lived it. That recognition bound them in a silence deeper than any confession could reach. He closed the drawer, turned down the lamp, and sat for a moment longer, letting the dark fill the room. In the quiet, the unspoken truth pressed close. Some burdens are not lifted, only carried together, and that was its own kind of mercy. In the quiet, the unspoken truth pressed close. Some burdens are not lifted, only carried together, and that was its own kind of mercy. The next morning broke cold, the kind of cold that kept the mist low along the ground. He took the path toward the river, tools in hand, and heard her footsteps behind him a short while later. She carried a bundle of clothes tucked under one arm, her shawl drawn tight, her breath quickening in the chill. The river was narrow here, but it moved with the steady pull of something that had been flowing long before either of them had names. She knelt on a flat rock near the bank, dipping the first shirt into the water and wringing it out before slapping it gently against the stone. Each motion was measured, deliberate, as though her body had memorized this ritual long ago and simply returned to it now. The cold water didn't seem to trouble her. She worked with her sleeves rolled, her wrists bare to the wind. He stood a few paces back, watching the current catch threads of sunlight and carry them downstream. Out of the corner of his eye he saw it, a figure on horseback, still against the skyline, too far for details, too long in place to be chance. The man on the ridge did not move. The horse shifted once, then settled, its rider fixed in quiet observation. He picked up his rifle from where it leaned against a cottonwood trunk and walked toward her, but stopped short, leaving the space for her to notice him before he spoke. She paused mid-motion, the wet fabric dripping into the river, and glanced up at him. There was no fear in her look, only a calm acknowledgement that told him she had seen the watcher too. He raised his hands slightly, empty, a gesture meant to say he was there, not to take over, not to decide for her. The figure on the ridge lingered a moment longer, before turning the horse and melting back into the folds of the land. The wind carried the sound of hoofbeats only briefly before they vanished. She finished rinsing the last shirt, wrung it dry and laid it across a branch to take the sun. On the walk back she broke a thin willow switch from the riverbank and carried it upright in her hand, saying nothing of its purpose. At the cabin door she set it against the frame as if it belonged there, a quiet mark of protection or warning. He said nothing, but later, when no one was watching, he added a second nail to the latch. It wasn't fear, it was a promise, wordless and solid as wood. It wasn't fear, it was a promise, wordless and solid as wood. The days settled into a rhythm after that, a quiet sequence of tasks and silences that began to hold their own weight. The morning light came cold but steady, slipping through the single east-facing window and falling across the table where she stood breaking corn into a shallow pan. The sound was soft, a steady crack of kernels that seemed to mark the passing of time better than any clock could. When he stepped outside, the air was sharp enough to wake the lungs, but there was no wind. The yard was still. She had already fed the chickens, scattering grain with the calm precision of someone who had decided to stay long enough to see the flock through the season. She moved among them without looking toward the road she had once measured with her eyes every morning. Inside, his old hat hung on the peg by her shawl. It was the same hat he had kept through years of sun and dust, the one he had refused to lend even for an hour. Now it rested there as though it had always belonged in that place, a quiet token of something that didn't need naming. He noticed it each time he passed the door, not with surprise, but with the steady recognition that it no longer felt strange. She did not speak of leaving, and he did not ask if she meant to. In the slow language of shared work and shared air, some questions lose their shape until there is nothing left to answer. Still, as he mended a bridle at the table, he caught himself wondering if staying had ever been the point at all, or if the point was simply finding a place where leaving no longer pressed at the edges of every thought. That night, the lamp burned low. She sat by the fire, sewing a hem that had frayed at the edge, her head bent to the work, her hair catching the glow in strands. He watched her hands move, steady, unhurried, and felt the strange, quiet certainty that the road outside could wait as long as it needed. The cabin held its breath, as if it too understood the value of what was not being said.